Won't my kid just listen? How many times do I have to say the same thing before it sticks? Why can they find every piece of a Lego set but not the shoes sitting right in front of them? Why do they fall completely apart when plans change over something really small? And how on earth can they focus for 3 hours straight on something they love but not 15 minutes on homework? If you've asked any of those questions, then you're in the right place because the answer to all of them is the same, and it's not what you might think. It's not laziness, it's not defiance, it's not irresponsibility or immaturity or bad attitude. It's a set of specific teachable brain skills that they are still developing. Skills that, when understood and coached by us as parents, actually yield responsibility, initiative, resilience, and yes, even impulse control that changes behavior. This series is about those skills, and understanding them is going to change how you parent your child. I want you to picture an air traffic control tower. If you've ever looked at a flight tracking app, all those planes in the air at one time, dozens of them, moving in different directions at different altitudes, all over the place. And they all need to land safely. You already have a picture of what your child's brain is managing every single day. Remember your homework, finish your breakfast, don't forget your shoes, listen to your parents, stop arguing with your siblings, stay on task, regulate your emotions, ignore the distractions, shift gears because plans just changed. All of that at once in a brain that is actually still under construction. Because though it may sound simple to us, we've had decades of practice. Our brains are fully formed, but your child is still working with a developing system. And the part of the brain that's responsible for managing all of that incoming traffic and then deciding what to do with it is called the prefrontal cortex. And that's actually the last part of the brain to fully mature. It's not fully developed until the mid 20s. Now, researchers Peg Dawson and Richard Garr, whose work on executive function has been foundational for educators and parents, actually describe the prefrontal cortex as the brain's CEO. The part that is supposed to be in charge, the executive. And like any executive, it governs a specific set of functions. They call them executive functions. And depending on what research you follow, they may classify them based off of 3, 5, 8, 11, sometimes even 12. But we're going to break it apart in this series to look at each of the 11 executive functions one by one. Now, here's the roadmap of what we're going to look at because I want you to have all of it up front. Because over these next 11 episodes, we're going to deep dive into each one, and I want you to be able to see the whole picture when we get started. As I name them, see if you can hear your own child in it. 1, impulse control, the ability to think before acting. So the child who blurts out, hits, grabs, or reacts before they've had a single moment to consider what they're actually doing, that's a child who's still developing impulse control. And it looks different across different genders and across different ages. We'll dive into that in the next session. 2, working memory. That's holding key information in mind while also using it. The child who got instructions 60 seconds ago has already lost them completely. You're thinking, it was only 3 instructions. Well, they're struggling to keep the 3 instructions in mind while they're focusing on which one they're doing. So we can build working memory. 3, emotional control. This means keeping feelings in check. The child whose reaction to a small frustration seems wildly out of proportion to everyone in the room except for them, that's a child who still needs help building emotional control. 4, cognitive flexibility. This is the ability to adjust to unexpected changes. That child who completely falls apart when the plans change, even when it's something minor, like we're going to go to the library first and then the grocery store. You're still going the 2 same places, but a different order. But their brain had already committed to the way it was supposed to go, and it's having trouble shifting. That's cognitive flexibility. 5, sustained attention. This is the ability to stay focused on a task. The child who can hyper-focus on something they love for hours, like Legos or coloring, but they can't maintain that attention on anything else for even 15 or 5 minutes, that's just a child who needs help training executive function. 6, task initiation. This is the child who needs help with taking action to get started. They know what they're supposed to do. You just told them the directions and they repeated them back to you. They can tell you every step, but they're still sitting there 20 minutes later and they haven't started. It's because their brain needs help learning how to initiate the task. 7, planning and prioritization. This is where we set goals and work towards them. A child who knows that a project is due on Friday and is just now opening the instructions on Thursday night, it's not because they didn't care. It's because their brain didn't learn how to build a backward map from the deadline to the start. Now, some of that has to do with 2 other executive functions we're going to talk about, so they kind of go hand in hand. But that ability to plan and then prioritize the steps is its own executive function. Now, organization. This has something to do sort of with planning and prioritization because it's keeping track of things physically and mentally. So like that backpack that's a disaster, the desk that is so messy you can't navigate it, the child who loses everything, it's not because they're careless. It's because their brain doesn't automatically create buckets or maintain systems, which then affects planning and prioritization. Then number 9 is time management, again, which affects planning and prioritization. But this is the ability to use that time efficiently. It's the child who has no sense of how long things are going to take. They genuinely believe that they can shower, eat breakfast, find their shoes, and pack their bag in 4 minutes. They honestly believe that. It just takes practice to help them understand how much time does something actually take and how do we use that time efficiently. And in that episode, we'll also talk about time horizon so that they understand how to plan timing appropriately for that planning and prioritization to take place. Number 10, goal-directed persistence. So this is actually a third one that relates to planning and prioritization because this is the child who can stay the course even through difficulty. The child who can stay that course is one that has goal-directed persistence versus the child who gives up the moment that something gets hard. It's not because they don't care about the goal anymore, but it's because their brain sees a barrier. It sees a wall. That sustained effort has given up because they don't realize that frustration is actually a skill that their brain needs in order to keep building. And so we have to teach them that persistence is what yields resilience, and it's through setting goals. And then finally, number 11, metacognition. This is basically a big word that means to think about thinking. So the child who has no idea why they keep making the same mistake, who can't reflect on their own process or adjust their approach, it's because they don't have that self-awareness yet to pause and say, like, wait a minute, why did I do that? What was I thinking? And again, that is a skill that can be developed. These skills actually matter far more than just homework and chores and getting out the door on time. That's what we see today. But actually, executive function influences not only academic success, but emotional regulation, resilience, relationships, decision-making, and the ability to navigate adulthood well. So, none of us are born with executive function fully formed. It actually grows over time with practice, with coaching, and with a patient-informed adult who understands what they're actually looking at in that child and can say like, oh, I see what's missing. I can help develop it. And so it takes time and example and practice. Now, I mentioned this already, but I think it's really important to note here before we jump into the series, this planning time horizon. I want to give you a piece of information that actually will reframe a significant amount of conflict that you experience daily. Every age has what we call a time horizon or a window of future time that they can hold in their mind and that they can plan with it. So in early childhood, that child who's between the ages of 3 and 6, they can only see really 3 to 4 hours ahead of time. So think about it. You drop them off at pre-K or kindergarten and you tell them like, oh, I'll be back this afternoon. That's 8 hours from now. They don't necessarily have the ability to see that far. They have the ability to see towards lunch. Now, the middle childhood age, the 6 to 9 age, their time horizon is about 6 to 8 hours. So they can see from the morning to right about the end of the school day, but not necessarily beyond that, things that are happening after school. That's why once we pick them up, we then give them the instructions for the rest of the day because that's what their brains can hold. But hopefully this also explains a little bit about why they have so much trouble planning big projects. And so in school, we structure tasks and activities in such a way to where we just give them one day at a time of planning because that's the horizon for which they can see. Now, by the time they start to enter their preteen years or that late childhood, the 9 to 12-year-old range, they can see longer. They can see almost half a day, so 8 to 12 hours. So they can wake up in the morning and you can let them know what's happening in the evening time. Now, just because they can't always see that far doesn't mean that you shouldn't start training the brain to do that. Even with our kids when they were very young, like 3, 4, 5, and 6, we would still give them the plans for the day so that they started to realize plans are made further in advance, but we wouldn't fault them for their inability to hold that information in their mind or to make plans based off of it. But it certainly made things easier when we would pick them up from school and they had their own plans for what they wanted to do. And we'd say, remember this morning we talked about we're going to the library this afternoon. And then they would think, oh, yes, okay, I forgot. We've at least warned them and let them know. And they realize that there's time and space beyond what their brain comprehends, but we don't expect them to hold on to that. Now, by the time they hit around the age of 12 and older, they can start to plan a few days ahead, so 2 to 3 days. But this is also why your high schooler who got a project due in 6 weeks procrastinates a little bit because they have a really hard time planning more than 2 to 3 days in advance, which is why when we get to those sections in the executive function series, we're going to talk about chunking tasks and breaking it up to where it does happen in 2 to 3 day blocks, or for younger kids in 1 day blocks or 6-hour blocks. It doesn't mean you can't give them a longer project with a longer time horizon. It just means that you have to chunk it down to where their brain can process. So, like I said, that 10-year-old who needs to manage that project in 2 weeks, it's not that they're being defiant, it's not that they're being resistant, it's not that they're being lazy. It's that their neurodevelopment has not been conditioned yet to meet what is actually an unrealistic expectation. Now, for the child with ADHD or significant executive function delays, we have to reduce that horizon by about 40%. So Friday's deadline is not real on Monday morning to them yet. Not because they don't care, but because their brain can't see that far ahead. Here is a reframe that we will talk about that holds this whole series together. Dr. Ross Greene put it this way: kids do well when they can. They want to. But if your child is not doing well, it's usually because something is getting in the way. The most important question we can learn to ask is this a won't or is this a can't? A won't is a choice. The skill is there, but the child's choosing not to use it. That's one conversation. But can't is a gap. And the skill is not yet fully developed, but it doesn't mean that it can't be developed. It just means it's going to take some time and some effort. But when we layer on consequences, it's not going to build that skill. Punishment is not going to build that skill. Shame will not build that skill. Only coaching, scaffolding, and practice builds that skill. So if they won't, then consequences may be real, a reality, a real thing that is appropriate. But if it's a can't, we have to figure out where the skill gap is lagging, and we need to help them. So most of what gets labeled as a won't is actually a can't. And the parent who learns to see the difference between won't and can't and asks that question before responding, it changes everything about the outcome. Now, long before neuroscientists identified executive function and mapped the prefrontal cortex, God was already developing these skills in his people. Scripture simply called it wisdom. I want to show you a picture of what it looks like. God called Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt, and Moses responded with a series of I can'ts. He said, I can't speak well. I'm slow of speech and tongue. I'm not equipped for what you're asking. Here's what God does not do. He does not say, we'll try harder. He does not say, stop making excuses. And he does not shame the gap or demand that the skill be present. He equips Moses. He said, who made your mouth? I will be with your mouth. And then here's Aaron. He will speak for you. And then here is your staff. And then here is what you will say, and here is what will happen. Step by step, he gave him provision for every gap. That is what executive function support looks like. Not demanding the skill exist, not labeling the absence of it as a character flaw, not shaming them, but walking alongside them, providing what's missing and building toward that capacity. Because when we scaffold and provide what's missing, they slowly start to ingest it and learn it for themselves. And we're going to start to see over time that we have to provide less support because they're starting to learn it. Now, I want to say something else before we move to the practice. If you are already seeing pieces of yourself in some of these descriptions, you are not alone. Executive function is just as relevant to childhood as it is to adulthood. It is a lifelong growth area. Many of the struggles that we experience as adults, like procrastination, being overwhelmed, impulsive decisions, difficulty staying organized, and even emotional reactivity, they trace back to some of these skills. God is still developing them in us, which means that the work that we do alongside our children is often the same work that He's doing in us. So everything in this series is going to be applied through my Notice It, Name It, Nurture It framework. If you're new here and haven't watched the first series, take a moment to go back and pull up the Notice It, Name It, Nurture It one. The link is in the description because everything that we do here will build on that foundation. Or if you prefer to read, you can grab my book on Amazon. Here's how we're going to apply it to executive function this week. I want you to first notice it. Think about a behavior in your home that has been a repeated point of frustration, a battle you keep having, a pattern that doesn't seem to change no matter how hard you try. Now ask yourself, is there an executive function skill underneath this? Is this actually a skill gap rather than a character flaw or choice? Is it won't or is it can't? Look at those 11 domains. Which one are you actually looking at in the child in front of you who's struggling? Then name it. Which executive function does the child seem to struggle with? Name it specifically. Don't say they're so disorganized, but say their organization and time management skills are still developing. Don't say they never listen, but say their working memory makes holding multiple instructions difficult, or they're having a difficult time figuring out where to get started. When you name the skill gap accurately, you stop labeling the child's identity and you start coaching their capacity. And then nurture it. Choose one executive function skill in your child that's already showing strength. This becomes the praise point for the week, the specific, genuine feedback that is tied to a skill. Like, I notice how you stuck with that even when it got hard. That's goal-directed persistence, and it matters. It's helpful in life. Then choose one skill that needs development. This is where you can parent with purpose this week. Not with consequences, but with coaching. One small scaffold, one moment of walking alongside them instead of demanding from a distance. Maybe that's a chore chart. Maybe that's a morning checklist. Maybe that's a routine for bedtime. Maybe that's offering 1 or 2 step instructions instead of 3 and 5 step instructions. We're going to unpack all of those tools that you can use in the subsequent episodes. Well, I hope that you have learned from this episode that your child's brain is like an air traffic control tower, but it is still being built. The controllers are learning, the systems are developing, and some planes are going to have a rough landing while they figure it out. But your job is not to punish the turbulence. It's to understand what's happening in the tower and to coach that skill so that the landings become smoother over time. Over the next 11 episodes, we'll go deeper onto every single domain. Each one starts with the behavior that frustrates you the most, and then it ends with a clear picture of what your child's brain is actually doing and what that brain needs from you. So if this reframe is landing for you, please be sure to share it and subscribe so that you don't miss the future episodes. I ask you to share it because there is a parent in your circle who has been misunderstanding or has lost hope, thinking like my child's just never going to learn. But they've been labeling won't when really it should be labeled can't. And then if you personally want to go deeper to understand what executive function coaching looks like in your specific home with your specific child, with the specific behaviors that are creating challenges, I am always available at theKairosBridge.com. That's exactly the work I do, and I love to walk alongside families like yours. Until next time, be well.